We know oil protects engine bearings spinning at thousands of RPM. But when metal is moving that incredibly fast, even a fraction of a second of metal-on-metal contact can turn a running machine into literal scrap metal. So let's dive right into this explainer and look at the standards that actually keep that from happening. Now, obviously, that oil needs to be clean. But I kind of want to challenge your intuition here. What does clean actually mean in this context? Is it just holding a sample up to the light, and if you don't see any dirt floating around, you're good to go? Well, definitely not. The answer is that clean is absolutely not a subjective visual check. It's a hard, real, measurable number. We're talking about contamination that's completely invisible to the naked eye, but is still big enough relative to those ultra-tight bearing clearances to cause catastrophic wear. So we rely on a formal particle count POD. This is a strict laboratory standard defining the absolute maximum allowed number of microscopic particles per oil sample, broken down into very specific size bands. It really is the only reliable way to verify true cleanliness. Now, here's where it gets really interesting for this specific setup. You've got two independent lube systems, right? TLO, or turbine lube oil, and GLO, the generator lube oil. There are two completely separate oil circuits, but here's the kicker. They do not share the same cleanliness standard. They are held to two genuinely different codes. So picture this. When you're out there flushing these systems prior to commissioning, that generator oil has its own particle count standard to pass. But the turbine oil, that side has to meet a noticeably stricter, far tighter class. If you look across the different microscopic size bands, from just a tiny handful of microns up past 100 microns, the allowable count for TLO is materially lower. It's a much higher bar to clear. And this beautifully illustrates just how demanding that turbine side actually is. The TLO system uses a high-performance synthetic ester oil, while the generator side just gets by with standard mineral oil. Why the difference? Well, it all comes down to the environment. Those turbine bearings operate under insane heat and spin incredibly fast, which means their operating clearances are extremely tight. They simply cannot tolerate the same margin for contamination as the cooler, slower-running generator bearings. To put it simply, think of it like the difference between a coarse kitchen sieve and a fine paper coffee filter. They both do the job of filtering, sure, but they're built for completely different expectations. You're obviously not going to use a metal sieve to brew your morning espresso, right? The same logic applies here. The generator bearings are the sieve. They have a slightly higher tolerance. The turbine bearings? They're that ultra-fine coffee filter. So the golden rule here is that acceptable particle size depends entirely on what's downstream. Because of this, when you're doing a TLO flush, you might literally need to keep going until a lab sample shows essentially 0 particles above 100 microns. That is way stricter than the GLO tolerance. You don't just flush until you think it looks okay. You flush, pull a sample, wait for the lab, and repeat until you hit that exact particle count standard. No shortcuts.
Okay, but let's zoom out for a second and look at the overall health of the engine. Because particles, as bad as they are, aren't the only threat to your oil. Chemical degradation introduces these massive hard limits that a simple particle count is never going to catch. You could literally have an oil sample that passes the particle count with flying colors, but still needs to be drained and discarded right that second.
Here's a perfect example of one of those hard limits. Turbine lube oil has to be changed immediately if the water content exceeds roughly 1,000 parts per million. Once you hit that 1,000 ppm mark, the water contamination has severely compromised the oil's ability to actually protect those high-speed bearings. And let's be real, absolutely no mechanical filter is going to fix a chemical breakdown. Likewise, we've got the total acid number, or TAN. If that exceeds roughly 1.0 milligrams of potassium hydroxide per gram, that's another absolute hard limit. Hitting that 1.0 mark is a giant red flag, signaling severe chemical degradation. It mandates an immediate oil change. These aren't just suggestions. These are strictly non-negotiable thresholds in the maintenance program. All right, let's apply this to a real-world scenario. Imagine you're out in the field, maybe you're facing some serious production pressure, and you realistically only have time to run one single extra flush cycle before startup. Where do you focus your effort? Are you flushing the TLO or the GLO? You prioritize the TLO every single time. Because of its significantly stricter NAS-style class and those incredibly tight turbine clearances we talked about, the TLO system has practically zero room for error compared to the mineral oil generator system. Throwing that one extra flush at the TLO provides the most critical protection for the absolute most sensitive part of the machine. So, to wrap this up, here are the major takeaways you need from this explainer. First off, clean is not an opinion. It is a formal, exact particle count. Second, TLO and GLO have very different limits because their bearings are dealing with entirely different operational stresses. And finally, those hard thresholds for water and total acid number, they dictate immediate oil replacement no matter how good your particle counts look. Understanding exactly why these distinct standards exist means the next time you're looking at a lab report, you'll know exactly what the machine is telling you it needs.
So, clean oil protects all that expensive metal spinning around inside the machine. But what happens if a highly pressurized, superheated fuel leak occurs on the outside? What's stopping that whole enclosure from basically becoming a bomb? Well, in our next explainer, we're going to dive into the gas and flame detectors that monitor the enclosure and look at exactly how those sensors are calibrated. It's a really crucial topic, so stay tuned and keep learning.